Hello and welcome to Dialogue. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced his first annual budget, a $6 trillion spending plan for fiscal year 2022. Well, the budget will bring the U.S. federal expenditure to the highest level since the Second World War, and it is estimated the deficit could exceed $1.3 trillion in the next decade. But will Biden's proposal be implemented smoothly? Who will pay for the deficit? And what impact will his plans have on the U.S. relationship with China? To find out more, I'm joined by Professor Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, who is a director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Andy Mogg, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Steve King, crowd-founded Professor of Economics on Petron. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, Jeffrey. The annual budget by Joe Biden to Congress focuses on infrastructure, education, and health care. First of all, what is your take on the budget priorities?
I think President Biden is trying to move the United States in the right direction, more investment, both in people, in technology, and in infrastructure. So this is a good agenda. He faces resistance from the opposition party. The Republicans are united. They oppose the tax increases that President Biden is calling for to help pay for these spending priorities. I think President Biden's absolutely correct. The corporations and America's rich should be paying more in taxes. The Republican Party is committed to protecting the rich and the powerful. I disagree wholeheartedly. That's really the political battle right now.
So how big a departure is this from President Trump's economic plan, and what kind of political resistance will Biden get in the Congress?
Trump's economic plan was to give as much money as fast as possible to the rich. He presided over a massive corporate tax cut in 2017, which reduced the tax payments by corporations by around 1 percentage point of GDP, which was not affordable, but also taking the U.S. in the wrong direction, because we need more spending, more investment in particular, in infrastructure and in skills. Biden is trying to turn that around. But the Republicans are saying, don't touch those tax breaks we gave to the rich, even though we have more wealth and greater inequality of income than in our modern history. In other words, the rich have gotten incredibly rich, partly because of the tax cuts, partly because of shifts in the economy. They ought to be paying more. That's really what Biden is saying. And interestingly, the American public is strongly behind the president, with about 65 to 70% of the public saying, yes, tax the rich and tax the companies in order to spend more on social priorities. But, you know, public opinion doesn't necessarily count when the rich have so much power as they do in American politics, and that's the drama that we're seeing play out right now.
Spending, spending, and spending. Andy, of course, the amount of the government spending this time, $6 trillion, that's a 35% increase from 2020, and that will put it into $1.3 trillion deficit after that in the next decade. How should we look at the spending and the deficit of the U.S. federal government?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Zhou Yue. These numbers are historic, unprecedented, and frankly, jaw-dropping. But I think if we look at the bigger picture here, and that whether consciously or not, I think this $6 trillion plan is a tacit administration by the Biden administration that the quote-unquote American way is not working for the American people. And that, in fact, I think they are taking a page from China's playbook, where China has recognized that government not only can, but should take the lead in infrastructure, in other key elements of the economy. As Jeffrey was saying, that as the rich has gotten richer in the United States. But that has political motivations and reasons behind it, that the rich, the big companies, wealthy individuals have really untrammeled political power. And Biden is trying to rein that in, and I think, again, tacitly, and whether it's consciously or not, recognizing that the Chinese way, if we can call it that, where the wealthy, the powerful companies do have their place, but government should take the lead. And I think this is the Biden administration's attempt to do that. Now, there's going to be significant challenges, how much money it's going to cost, where it's going to come from, the deficit, et cetera. These are important questions, but certainly the motivation, I think, is for government to take the lead.
And during the election campaigns, Biden has been criticized by Trump for going socialist for America. Do you think all those social spendings will probably put him in that light and probably cost him politically?
Well, I think this is a dangerous time for the U.S. because exactly of this polarization, where in certain circles, to be called a socialist is the worst possible kind of epithet. But if we look at the substance of what Biden is doing, investing in physical infrastructure, investing in people through increased education, childcare, again, these are not just smart things to do that a country like China has long recognized the importance of, but it's also the decent and the humane thing to do. And I think this is, again, the U.S., for various reasons, has been quite a cruel, and we could even say barbaric place for many people. And I think Biden and his team are looking to remedy that. And the big question remains, can he overcome this enormous political divide to make improvements?
And Steve, let's look at the plan itself. It highlights the American Jobs Plan and the Families Plan, which requests an increase of 41% for the Department of Education and 23% for the Department of Health and Human Services. So are they just political convenient, or they are actually a response to what is happening in America? Steve? I'm afraid Steve didn't hear me. I want to throw this question to Jeffrey because people worry that this is for scoring political points for Democrats.
Well, it's not really about political points. And also, everything needs to be kept in perspective of the massive size of the U.S. economy. So these are big numbers, but they also are part of a big economy. The U.S. economy produces $23 trillion of output per year. On average, during the coming decade, the estimate is the U.S. economy will produce about $28 trillion a year. So the spending that President Biden is talking about is somewhat modest, actually, relative to the size of the U.S. economy. It's very much needed, but it's not unaffordable in any way. It is a different perspective from what we've had under conservative, what we call conservative right-wing governments like Trump's. But it is affordable. The question is whether the political system will back the rather modest increases of taxes that the president's calling for.
Yeah.
It's less than 2% of national income, all this drama about the proposed tax increases. So it's quite affordable, but it produces a political storm, and as was just rightly said, all sorts of epithets and charges are thrown around. If people can understand the numbers, the magnitudes involved, the realism of this program, it's actually a very affordable and sensible program.
You said it's affordable,
by the way,
but there is the question of afforded by whom, because the sharp raised taxes on corporations and high-income households, and Republicans against this kind of policy is because they will hurt the economy, corporations will suffer, and rich people will ship their money away. What do you say to that?
Oh, well, it doesn't worry me too much. The rich have gotten so rich and have done so well. The corporations used to pay about 4% of national income in taxes, then cut after cut after cut in recent decades has brought their tax bill down to 1% of GDP. They're having a ball. CEO salaries are at all-time highs. They're partying. They're buying super yachts. I'm not worried about them at all. But I am concerned about the average American household, which needs the kind of support in this legislation. So it's a little bit of a game. But, also the media, Rupert Murdoch, who's himself a billionaire, controls a lot of the media and represents the interests of the super rich. And so we hear a lot of phony propaganda and worry and charges. After all, it was just 4 years ago when Trump proposed the corporate tax cut. We were told all the miracles that would occur by giving the rich even more money. None of that happened. So we had already an experiment. Do you have to shovel even more tax breaks to the rich? The answer is, of course not. A normal society, not only China, all of Europe, Canada, is so much wiser than the United States has been, because U.S. politics, I wouldn't say it's wiser, that the political system has delivered. It's a system that has delivered for the rich, but not for the average American in recent years, and that's what needs to change.
And Jeffrey, still some people would argue there were some compromises made there, especially on tax, because the plan does include some tax cuts. It is silent on individual tax breaks scheduled to lapse in 2025, and a $10,000 cap on a state and local tax deduction. So what do you make of Biden's silence on tax cuts opposed by many Democrats?
Well, Biden's trying to collect some more revenues, and some of the Democrats wanted tax cuts for their own constituencies. I wasn't very enamored of that because we need more tax revenues, so we don't need more tax cuts for either constituency, frankly. What President Biden is trying to do is change direction in the U.S., and that's not easy. This is a massive ocean liner. Changing the direction of this ship is not simple. That's the political battle. You don't get everything done all at once under any circumstance. So if President Biden can succeed in getting this package through politically, I think it changes the course for the United States. More investment in the future, a fairer society, a greener society, which all of our countries need. This is a good program, but it is in a heatedly divided political system that has not been working very well.
All right. Thank you, Jeffrey. And Andy, do you foresee a strong political blowback from the Republicans? What kind of a roadmap we'll be seeing there?
Well, I think that is the key question, Zhou Yue. Certainly, the degree of animosity towards Joe Biden seems less visceral than against Obama, and one can speculate about reasons for that. But that being said, I think that Jeffrey makes a good point that Biden's plans will dramatically impact very powerful interests. Look at the corporate tax rate that is expected to go from 21% to 28%, which is an increase of a third. Now, one can make all kinds of arguments that this will be very bad for the stock market. It'll hurt corporate profits. Stocks will go down. People's 401ks, et cetera, will be hurt by this. And I think this will be certainly, seems like a very plausible line of attack by the Republicans, in addition to some of the demonizing of this being socialist, et cetera. So I think, again, it's a tough road ahead for this, and the devil's in the details, and I think we will have to wait and see, despite this, I think, philosophically being a move in the right direction.
And Andy, there is also an international aspect of this. For example, the defense budget. The budget marks a $5 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Some people say it is created to counter China. So what does this budget shift say about China-U.S. relationship?
Well, I see it more as a symptom and a reflection of a broader recalibration and shift that started with the Trump 2017 national security strategy, deeming Russia and China as the biggest threats to the United States. And this is not just a Republican phenomenon, but a bipartisan one. Although I do have to say that I think the Biden administration has been much more measured, much more rational, I would say, in approaching this, despite, I think, still the fundamental basis for viewing this China challenge, or perhaps China threat, is misguided. But still, be that as it may, we can still hope that things will get better.
And actually is in line with Biden's strategic thinking, because the acting director of the White House Budget Office, Shalanda Yang, stated that Biden is changing to the long-term view to invest in infrastructure and bring competitiveness with China. But do you think America can spend its way into outcompeting China?
Well, again, Zoe, I think this really is the crucial question. Increased resources, money being one of the most important resources, is necessary, but certainly not enough to guarantee success. And here, I think one of the reasons here that, again, it's unfortunate that the U.S. is organized this way, but there are powerful centrifugal forces that make it difficult for Americans to be united. I think one of the main reasons is that the U.S. is more a state versus a nation, but that then politicians, political leadership find it not just convenient, but perhaps crucial that there be an external adversary that can act as a binding agent to bring Americans together, and this is a part of this. Again, looking at it from an optimistic, glass half full perspective, a truly confident America could be good not just for the U.S., but for China and the world, because then it would be less anxious, less fearful, less looking to lash out at perceived adversaries, and focusing on doing what it does best. Look at university education, look at innovation in a lot of areas, and really focusing on becoming better versus looking at others and thinking how to beat them.
Andy, there is another issue of the long-term financial viability. The debt has surged. The current U.S. debt ceiling is $21 trillion. That was determined in March 2019, but as of April this year, the debt has already reached $28 trillion. Probably it will go even higher. So do you foresee that America will run into debt problems or even crises?
Well, I think this is the other very important question. On the one hand, if we look at classical economics, printing money, the monetization of debt leads to inflation. On the other hand, there are arguments now being made that maybe this doesn't matter that much. And I think one of the most crucial variables that many people are watching, including Janet Yellen, who talks about this being one of her most important metrics, is how much interest is being paid on this debt. And because of historically low interest rates, even though the debt level is at very high amounts, but the amount of interest being paid is actually lower than the historical average. So I think we are looking at two very important questions. Does the absolute level of the debt matter? And what happens if or when interest rates rise?
But interest rates rise will probably when inflation is a serious problem. But according to the data from the Commerce Department, that the price index increased 3.1% in April from 2020. It seems that not many serious economists worry about the immediate danger of inflation. Why is that?
Well, I wouldn't say that economists are not worried about this. Certainly, I think the Biden administration and their economists described this as transitory, these price rises. On the other hand, again, this is the problem with economics, is I think that no one really knows the right answer. And a lot of this is guesswork, educated guesswork at best.
Okay.
And that we may be the beginning of a very powerful inflation surge that would parallel that of the 1970s. And think back then, interest rates had to be raised to something like 16% under Paul Volcker. So again, I think this is a very, very important,
When do you
crucial
think that is
variable.
going to happen?
I'm sorry?
When do you think that is going to happen?
Well, that is a very good question, Zoya. I know that exactly because of these dynamics, that the Fed recognizes how important this is and is, I think, under political pressure as well as recognition of fulfilling its mandate, that doing what it can to keep interest rates at a reasonable level. And we all know, too, that despite the best intentions of central banks and finance ministries and the U.S. Department of Treasury, things can go quite against what people aim for. So stay tuned.
But the reason I ask this because we have already seen some early signs. Some people criticize the U.S. for what they say, quote, monetization of fiscal deficits, and that will push up the U.S. Printing money and afford to have fiscal deficits. And that also led to raw material prices going all the way up. Do you think the world should worry about what the U.S. is doing financially?
Well, the world, whether it wants to or not, I think must worry about this phenomenon in the U.S. First of all, of course, the U.S. dollar is central to many global financial transactions, the payment system, etc. Most important commodities are denominated in dollars. So this is very important, not just to the United States, but, Zoya, as you say, to many countries and people around the world. And we can see the devastating impact that happens in the developing world, even in the developed economies of Europe, when the U.S. gets it wrong. We only have to go back to the great financial crisis to see the devastation that was wrought, not just in the U.S., but all around the world.
And come back to China. Some people say because of the indebtedness in America, that draw down the value of dollars, and on the other hand, the Chinese currency has been appreciating its values recently. Do you think those things are closely linked, and what kind of a pressure will that have on China's economic policy?
Sure. Well, I think this is something that we can attribute to, first, the philosophy of the Communist Party of China, which is very pragmatic, rational, and scientific, and making decisions by evaluating various alternatives, making trade-offs. And we can see over the years of reform, the management of the RMB, how the capital account is managed, how financial flows in and out of China are managed, that China has done a very good job of that. And I think on the one hand, looking to open and further integrate with the rest of the world, and of course an important part of that is the opening and reform of financial markets, as we've seen tremendous progress in this area, while also balancing against these risks of hot money pouring in and then perhaps leaving very quickly as well, the disruption that that can cause. So I think, again, this is something that the Chinese central bank, other authorities, of course, are keeping a very close eye on and developing effective measures for.
Okay, and we have Steve joining us on the line via phone. Steve, what is your take of the deficit spending in America in huge sum this time? Will developing countries and emerging economies suffer as a result of the spending in America?
No, they will not. They will benefit in the same way the American population will benefit from it. I'm sorry I missed part of the discussion courtesy of technical issues. But one thing which we learned from the Second World War is that when a government which produces its own currency decides to spend in excess of its taxation revenue, it actually creates the money that is necessary. And it not only creates the money, when it spends and hires GIs and employs companies to make tanks and so on, and we're going through the non-war version of that now with COVID, it actually creates money by putting it in people's bank accounts. It's not taking money from the public. In other words, it's giving money to the public. And on the other hand, the debt that's created by that is actually, when the government does that to put money in our personal bank accounts, it also has to put that same equivalent sum in the bank accounts that private banks have at the central bank, which we call reserves. And that is the increase in reserves is what actually enables the banking sector to buy those bonds off the government in the first place. So the government creates the capacity to buy its own bonds. It does not borrow money from the public. It does not borrow money from the banks. It creates money for both of them. And then on the financing side, when it sells the bonds to the banks, it lets the banks swap reserves which don't earn interest income for bonds which do earn interest income. The whole worry over the government needing to tax to spend its own finance spending is wrong, and this was acknowledged by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Bank of New York, in 1946 in a paper called Taxes for Revenue is Obsolete. Now, we've lost that lesson. We're relearning it with COVID. We should not forget it again. The deficit spending will benefit Americans and benefit the rest of the global economy.
And Biden has always been saying that his economic policies is to protect middle class in America. Do you think it will serve that purpose, and what kind of political benefits will that bring to Biden?
Well, enormous benefits, because what has happened with the whole marketization orientation from the days of Reagan and Thatcher forward is that we've been transferring money to the wealthy away from the poor. There's been an enormous distribution of income from workers to very wealthy capitalists. And even though wealthy capitalists have a large amount of money and spend it very extravagantly, they spend the same amount of money far more slowly than the working class does. So by making that transition, we've actually reduced the turnover of money and reduced the effectiveness of the economy. Now, what Biden is talking about is going back towards the direction of the 50s and 60s, when wages were decent, when private debt levels were lower, and where people spent money more freely because they weren't afraid of their financial situation. So this will benefit the economy and, ironically, even benefit the rich because they're effective parasitism.
And by taxing the rich and increasing corporate tax, do you think Biden will be able to foot the bill, the long-term fiscal stability?
Fiscal stability is generated by a government which spends sufficient money and runs a deficit that enables it to employ its people fully, which is what China's been doing very effectively for the last 20 years. And in some ways, COVID has slapped America in the face and said, the policies you've been following, neoliberal, neoclassical economics, is wrong. They don't understand how money works. You've done it by accident. We should do it deliberately.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, Andy. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.